August 15th, 2002. Bassett, Virginia. 50-year-old Michael Short and his 36-year-old wife Mary are found shot to death inside their home. The couple's 9-year-old daughter Jennifer is missing. 5 weeks later, Jennifer's remains are discovered over 30 miles away in a rural area of North Carolina, and it turns out she's been shot to death as well. The investigation turned up some promising leads, including a person of interest named Garrison Bowman, as well as an eyewitness sighting of an unidentified man in a truck who was parked across the street from the Short residence on the morning of the murders. However, these leads failed to bring about a resolution, so the Short family murders remain unsolved. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got a pretty harrowing case to cover today, the 2002 murders of the Short family. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Jackie Elliott, the winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Jackie. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been carrying on for 2 years now, and if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions near the end of this episode. Anyway, today's case was actually requested to me nearly 2 years ago by a listener named Tori, and while I was familiar with the case at that time, I didn't really start delving into it until recently. This is a disturbing story about a married couple who were shot to death inside their home and had their 9-year-old daughter abducted before her remains were discovered over 1 month later. It's always horrific when an entire family is murdered, but it's especially disturbing when there's very little idea about what the motive could have been. The crime almost seems to resemble a professional hit, but what could a seemingly ordinary blue-collar family like the Shorts have done to bring this on? Over the past several years, there have been a number of twists and turns in this story, including an individual who seemed like a promising suspect on the surface, as well as a corruption scandal involving the sheriff's department who investigated the case. But after all these years, there still aren't any conclusive answers about who did this and why, so this mystery deserves further exploration on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the Short family murders. Our story begins in 2002 in Bassett, Virginia, a small town of around 1,100 people located in Henry County. Our central figures are 50-year-old Michael Short, his 36-year-old wife Mary Short, and their 9-year-old daughter Jennifer. The family lives together in a red brick house alongside US Route 220, and Michael runs a business called MS Mobile Home Movers. At around 9 a.m. on the morning of August the 15th, one of Michael's employees stopped by his house and made a shocking discovery. Michael was lying dead on a couch inside the garage. He had been shot once in the head, and it would later be determined that he was likely sleeping at the time he was murdered. The police were immediately summoned to the scene, and when they arrived at the house and went inside, they discovered Mary's body in her bed. Like Michael, she had been shot once in the head while she was sleeping. It would turn out that Jennifer's bed was empty, as the sheets were pulled back and her pillow was on the floor. There was no trace of Jennifer inside the house, and it seemed likely she had been abducted by the same person who murdered her parents, so the Henry County Sheriff's Department immediately issued an Amber Alert for the missing child. There was no sign of any struggle, and nothing appeared to have been taken from the house. Since a wallet containing $70 in cash was still inside Michael's pocket, it was apparent that robbery was not the motive for the crime. A pair of .22 caliber shell casings were found, and the house's phone line had been cut. The employee who discovered the Shorts' bodies had been in the house the night before to work on a vehicle. He claimed that everything seemed fine when he left, and he was not considered a suspect in the murders. On the evening of August 14th, Michael had been seen buying candy for Jennifer at a gas station convenience store located near their house. The owner said Jennifer was excited to be going back to school and described her as being a quote-unquote bottle of joy. The last confirmed sighting of the family was when they were seen going through a Burger King drive-thru together in the nearby town of Collinsville at around 11 p.m. that night. The crime sent shockwaves throughout the community, and one woman who had known the Shorts for 10 years stated, quote, "They were just plain ordinary people. I don't know why anyone would want to kill them," end quote. Even though Jennifer could not be found, a funeral was held for her parents, and they were both laid to rest. In the months prior to the murders, Michael had made numerous trips to coastal South Carolina. Since business had become slow for his own mobile home moving company, Michael was hoping to get a job with a moving company in South Carolina and relocate there. He had also recently put his house up for sale, and in the days prior to the murders, a number of potential buyers had gone through the residence. If one of these buyers was the killer, this would have allowed them to learn the house's layout before they committed the crime. It also turned out that Michael often employed temporary migrant workers for his moving business. Since he would pay them in cash for a few hours' work, without taking down their personal information, it was impossible for investigators to compile a complete list of everyone who had ever worked for Michael. On September the 4th, the Henry County Sheriff's Department made the surprising decision to exhume Michael's remains. Before he met Mary, Michael had previously been married and had 2 adult sons who were ruled out as suspects in the murders. But rumors started to circulate that Michael was being exhumed in order to perform paternity testing and determine if he was actually Jennifer's biological father. Henry County Sheriff H. Frank Cassell denied this, claiming that the main reason for the exhumation was to collect hair samples which had not been taken during the original autopsy. But he addressed the paternity rumors in a rather cryptic fashion by stating, quote, "We knew the paternity about 10 days ago. That is one of the last things we would release. We're not saying for the simple reason it could be extremely important in this case," end quote. Just over 2 weeks later, investigators would release older photographs of Mary to the public for the purpose of seeking information from her former co-workers. About a decade earlier, Mary had been employed by the clothing manufacturer Pluma Incorporated and worked at their plant located in the Bowles Industrial Park. Sometime in 1992 or 1993, there was an incident where a man harassed Mary at the plant and was asked to leave the parking lot on several occasions. At one point, he was able to make it inside the plant before he was removed from the property. Unfortunately, no one could remember this man's name, only that he may have driven a white pickup truck at that time. No one could be certain if this incident had any connection to the murders, but police hoped that seeing the older photographs of Mary might help jog the memories of other employees who were working there at that time. But as far as I can tell, it doesn't look like they ever determined the identity of the man who harassed Mary. On September 25th, there would finally be a major development in the search for Jennifer in Rockingham County, North Carolina. A local resident saw his dogs playing with what appeared to be a turtle shell next to a creek under a bridge, but when he took a closer look at the object, he realized that it was a human skull, which appeared to belong to a child, and it had a bullet hole in it. He soon noticed that other skeletal remains, including teeth, a jawbone, and parts of a rib cage, were resting nearby. The police were instantly notified, and just over 1 week later, DNA testing positively identified the remains as belonging to Jennifer Short. The location she was found was just over 30 miles south of the Short residence, near the town of Stoneville. Jennifer was laid to rest alongside her parents, and Sheriff Cassell publicly revealed the results of the paternity testing and confirmed with 100% certainty that Michael was her biological father. Since the incident involving the harassment of Mary at the Pluma plant would have taken place around the approximate time period she became pregnant with Jennifer, there was speculation that the man may have acted this way because he believed he was Jennifer's biological father. According to Cassell, they did not want to rule out the possibility that this was the motive for abducting Jennifer and murdering her parents. If the abductor believed Jennifer was his daughter, he might have decided to get rid of her if it was publicly announced that Michael was the biological father. For this reason, the sheriff's department held back on confirming this information until it was conclusively verified that Jennifer was dead. Anyway, by the time Jennifer's remains were found, police already had a person of interest on their radar, a 66-year-old retired carpenter named Garrison Bowman. He first came to the police's attention through a man named Gary Lemons, who had been Bowman's landlord. Bowman had rented a house from Lemons in the town of Mayodan, North Carolina. He converted the house into a repair shop and lived inside a mobile home on the same property. By this point, Bowman had relocated to Canada and left his mobile home behind on a farm, which happened to be located only about a mile away from the location where Jennifer's remains were discovered. According to Gary Lemons, 2 days before the Shorts were murdered, Bowman complained to him that he had paid a man in Virginia to move his mobile home, and that if this man didn't move the home or return his money, he would have to kill him. On August the 15th, shortly after the murders took place, Lemons claimed that he stopped by Bowman's house until Bowman suddenly appeared holding a pistol and told him to leave. Lemons also recounted an incident where he saw Bowman installing a false floor in his van and drilling holes in the side of a compartment. By August the 16th, Bowman had left the area in his van and was heading for Canada. Shortly thereafter, Lemons was searching through Bowman's former house and found a map of Virginia with an X drawn on it, which appeared to match the approximate location of the Short home. Bowman was tracked down to a residence in Inuvik, a town located in the Northwest Territories. He would be arrested by Canadian authorities for immigration violations, as it turned out he had failed to disclose a previous DUI conviction when he originally entered the country. Bowman wound up being deported back to the U.S. and would be questioned about his potential role in the Short murders. While Bowman denied all of the allegations that Gary Lemons made against him, claiming he had never even met Michael Short, let alone paid him to move his mobile home. According to Bowman, his trip to Canada was not some spur-of-the-moment decision to flee the country, but rather a trip he had been planning for months, as he had been to Canada in the past and thought he might like to live there someday. The reason he left his mobile home behind was because he had transferred the deed to a friend in Michigan, but since the arrangements to move it there had not gone through, another friend let him leave it on his farm in Rockingham County. Bowman denied that he made any arrangements to pay someone in Virginia to move his mobile home, and claimed that Gary Lemons' story about waving a pistol at him was completely false. Bowman said he had never even owned a pistol, and the only weapon he did own was a shotgun he had given to a friend weeks before he left the area. Before he traveled to Canada, Bowman actually went to visit his aforementioned friend in Michigan on August the 17th. She would later say that she took a ride with Bowman inside his van and never saw a false floor like Lemons had described. For his part, Lemons passed a polygraph when asked about his accusations against Bowman, and the two men would be asked to testify in front of a federal grand jury. Some of Bowman's friends would also testify on his behalf, maintaining that he was innocent. They suspected that Lemons had falsely accused Bowman because he was bitter about Bowman's decision to transfer the deed to his mobile home to a friend rather than give it to him. Bowman's friends said that he was a heavy drinker who sometimes went through 1 case of beer per day. In fact, one of Bowman's friends was with him on the night before the murders and claimed that he drank so much beer that Bowman told him he was ready for bed by the time they went their separate ways. Bowman's supporters did not believe that an intoxicated 66-year-old man would have been capable of orchestrating a pair of murders and an abduction without leaving any incriminating evidence behind. The FBI performed an extensive investigation into Bowman, searching his mobile home, van, and personal possessions, but they could not find any hard evidence to link him to the murders. I also read that they took Bowman's DNA, and while I haven't seen any confirmation that it excluded him from being involved in the crime, I'm assuming they couldn't find his DNA at the murder scene either. In March of 2005, it was announced that 3 men would face charges for lying to federal investigators. It turned out they had shared a story about having seen a man matching Bowman's description carrying a child out of the Short home on the night of the murders. But upon further questioning, their story fell apart, and they soon admitted that they had made up the whole thing in order to collect the reward money. By 2007, the FBI publicly announced that they no longer considered Bowman to be a suspect, and he would die of natural causes on Christmas Day in 2014. The other big lead investigators had to work with was an eyewitness sighting from a couple who had been traveling along U.S. Route 220 at around 2 a.m. on the morning of the murders. They claimed they saw a man parked in a truck directly across the road from the Short residence. He was described as being in his 40s and having a quote-unquote weathered complexion. The truck was described as being a white, single-cab, 2-ton, 1998 to 2002 flatbed model with a stake body and wooden rails. A composite sketch was released for both the man and the truck, but they were never identified. As the years have gone on, investigators have explored the possibility that the murders took place because Jennifer was the killer's target. They have reached out and asked for Jennifer's childhood friends to come forward if they could remember any adult males giving Jennifer unusual attention during the time period she was abducted, but thus far, this has failed to produce any substantial leads. Well, there turned out to be a couple of surprising postscripts to this story, one of which involved the Henry County Sheriff's Department. In May of 2007, Sheriff Cassell would plead guilty to knowingly and willingly making a false material statement and representation to a Federal Bureau of Investigation's special agent. For the past several years, the Drug Enforcement Administration had been conducting an investigation into a massive drug distribution and money laundering ring in Henry County, as the Sheriff's Department was reportedly seizing drugs and reselling them at a major profit. The whole thing ballooned into a major corruption scandal, and in the end, 20 people, including Sheriff Cassell and 12 of his deputies, were arrested and charged with 48 different federal counts, which included dealing crack cocaine, marijuana, and ketamine. In exchange for his guilty plea, Cassell received an 8-month prison sentence, a $15,000 fine, and 2 years probation. While no evidence has ever been found to suggest this scandal was connected to the Short family murders, there was always speculation that perhaps the Sheriff's Department did not want the crime to be solved. The family's surviving relatives were always critical of how the police handled the investigation, believing that they may have caused crucial evidence to be destroyed by allowing too many people to wander in or around the Short home at the time the bodies were discovered. The final postscript occurred this past February when the Short home, which was unoccupied at the time, wound up burning to the ground, and I don't see any indication that investigators have ever publicly released the cause of the fire. Whatever the case, the authorities do not seem any closer to solving this crime than they were 17 years ago. On the 1-year anniversary of the murders, a memorial service was held for the family, in which a local reverend stated, quote, "The case is open. It's still an infected wound which cannot heal," end quote. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Now, since this case was originally requested to me nearly 2 years ago, I had been wanting to cover it for a while, and it was definitely on my mind last fall when the Jamie Kloss case was dominating the headlines. As you probably know, Jamie Kloss was a 13-year-old girl from Wisconsin who went missing after both her parents were found shot to death inside their home. During this time period, I even came across a few articles which made comparisons between the case and the Short family murders. Thankfully, this one had a much happier conclusion, as Jamie was discovered to be alive when she managed to escape from her captor 88 days after she originally went missing. And the man who murdered Jamie's parents and abducted her is going to remain in prison for the rest of his life. Sadly, Jennifer Short was not so lucky, since she was murdered by the same person who killed her parents, and all these years later, it seems like no one has the slightest idea who committed this crime or what their motive could have been. But I'm sure that seeing the circumstances of how the Kloss case played out has only increased speculation that Jennifer was the killer's target. To tell you the truth, when I first learned about this case, I figured that Garrison Bowman had to be the perpetrator. There were just a few too many coincidences for me to believe he wasn't involved, and I could not understand why the FBI stated that they no longer considered him a suspect. But the deeper you explore this case, the less sense it makes that Bowman could have committed this crime, but I'll talk more about him in a little while. For now, let's go back to the very beginning and examine how this crime unfolded. We know that Michael and Mary Short were murdered inside their home sometime between midnight and 9 a.m., and we've also got an eyewitness sighting of a potential suspect parked across the road from them at around 2 a.m. I'm not sure if this means anything, but I've always found it curious how Michael was sleeping on a couch inside the garage instead of in bed with his wife. If the killer knew Michael was going to be in there, I think this suggests that they were watching the family for a while before they made their move, perhaps even followed them when they made their late night run to Burger King. The fact that the house's phone line was cut does suggest a carefully planned, premeditated crime. While the evidence showed that Michael and Mary were both shot in their sleep and didn't even get the opportunity to react, it's unclear if Jennifer was abducted directly from her bed or if she was awakened by some noise and left her bedroom on her own. If it's the latter scenario, then this might mean that Jennifer was not the original target. If the killer's target was one or both of the parents, they may have intended to leave Jennifer alone, but then she unexpectedly woke up and saw them. The killer is uncertain about whether or not they want to kill a child, so they abduct Jennifer from the house while they decide what to do. But then they ultimately conclude that they cannot leave Jennifer alive as a witness, so she is murdered as well, and her body dumped in North Carolina. Since Jennifer was nothing more than skeletal remains at the time she was found, it was impossible to determine how long she was alive after she was abducted or if she was sexually assaulted. But it would not surprise me at all if the killer was some pedophile who wanted to kidnap Jennifer. It doesn't sound like the investigation has uncovered any potential suspects who displayed creepy behavior towards Jennifer before she was killed, but she was heavily involved with softball and other community activities, so she easily could have caught the eye of some predator without even realizing it. We know that the Shorts were planning to sell their home, and that some potential buyers had toured the place, so the killer may have posed as one so they could see the full layout of the house beforehand, allowing them to figure out the locations of the phone line and where everyone slept. Of course, the wildest rumor during the early stages of the investigation was that Michael was not actually Jennifer's biological father, and that her real father decided to come by and kidnap her, but this wound up being debunked pretty quickly. I'm not exactly sure why this particular rumor caught fire, but I guess it might have something to do with the fact that Mary apparently had a male stalker who kept showing up at her workplace in 1992 or 1993. It's never been explicitly implied that Mary ever had an affair with anyone, but if you do the math, these incidents would have taken place during the approximate time period she became pregnant with Jennifer, so I think this caused people's imaginations to run wild. It is pretty odd that people seem to remember the specific incidents with this man at her workplace, but no one seemed to know his actual name or why he was going after Mary. The details about this lead are frustratingly vague, but if they didn't have any other specific information about this man, then I'm guessing that Mary probably didn't talk about it that much over the course of the next decade, and the issue simply died down. It seems unlikely that this man would obsessively stalk Mary and then just stop before deciding to murder her 9 or 10 years later, so I have my doubts that this lead has any connection to the crime. I guess one of the biggest obstacles to figuring out what happened is that Michael and Mary just seemed like decent people who didn't have any enemies, yet the circumstances of their murders resemble some sort of professional hit. After all, cutting the house's phone line is a pretty calculated thing to do. I know there's been speculation about a potential cover-up by law enforcement because this crime took place in Henry County, which would become embroiled in a major corruption scandal only a couple years later. As you recall, no fewer than 20 people, 13 of them law enforcement officers, would be implicated in a drug distribution and money laundering ring, including the sheriff who investigated the case, H. Frank Cassell. Given the dissatisfaction the victim's loved ones felt about how the original investigation was handled, it is tempting to believe that the Henry County Sheriff's Department was somehow involved in the murders, or at the very least, knew more than they were letting on. If the killer was someone who was essential to their criminal operations, would the Sheriff's Department have been willing to cover up for them or protect them? While there is no evidence to support these allegations at all, I guess it's tempting to speculate that Michael could have been killed because he was involved in something drug-related. A mobile home moving business would have been a good cover to use to smuggle and transport drugs, and since the business allegedly had not been doing well on its own, perhaps Michael would have been desperate enough to become involved in something like this. Drug smuggling might also help explain why Michael took all those trips to South Carolina earlier that year. However, like I just said, this is all nothing more than speculation, and there's no indication that Michael was involved in anything illegal. And if this murder was drug-related, I don't see why the perpetrator would have bothered abducting Jennifer from the scene. I think it's likely just an unrelated coincidence that the Sheriff's Department investigating this case was involved in their own illegal activity. Let's put it this way, if the authorities had a vested interest in protecting the real killer, they had a convenient fall guy, Garrison Bowman, just drop into their laps during the early stages of the investigation. At the outset, many people believed there was a very compelling circumstantial case against Bowman, so if the Sheriff's Department really wanted to solve this crime bad enough, they probably could have pinned it on him. But they just couldn't make a case against Bowman stick, which leads me to believe that the Sheriff's Department was just as perplexed as everyone else about who really did this. For what it's worth, all of those corrupt police officers are long gone now, and the current sheriff and his department seem genuinely dedicated about solving this case. So now let's talk about the unidentified man seen in the truck parked across the road from the Short residence several hours before the family was found dead. A number of people believe that the type of flatbed truck this man was driving would have been an unusual vehicle to use to pull off a murder and an abduction. Since the truck was so distinct looking and no one seemed to recognize it, this lends credence to the idea that the man did not reside in the community. We still don't know for certain that this man was even the perpetrator, but if he was, then that would definitely rule out Garrison Bowman. The man was described as being in his 40s and clean-shaven, whereas Bowman was 66 years old and had a distinct Abraham Lincoln-style beard, and I see no indication that he would have had access to a truck like this at that time. I mean, it's possible that the man in the truck was nothing more than a red herring, and he had no involvement with the crime, but considering how little investigators have had to work with in this case, he's still the most promising lead. Incidentally, I've seen this case profiled on an episode of America's Most Wanted, and I'm quite amused by the interview with the eyewitness who saw the man, because she described him as looking a bit like Jim Varney. As you might know, Jim Varney was known for playing the comedy character Ernest P. Worrell, and they even showed a snippet from one of his movies in the America's Most Wanted episode. So I can safely say that this is the first and possibly the last time you'll ever hear an Ernest reference on this podcast. Anyway, this now leads us to Garrison Bowman. And I gotta say, I can't think of another example in which I've done a more complete 180 on a suspect while researching an episode. If you just read a basic summary of this case, you'll probably think there's no way that Bowman could not be the killer, but the further you dig, the more convinced you'll be that this guy was railroaded in a huge way. My initial impression of Bowman was that he was some creepy loner who lived a transient lifestyle and was probably the type of person who would travel from place to place and then move on if he ever harmed someone. But surprisingly, it turned out that Bowman had quite a few friends who were willing to go to bat for him and publicly share their belief that he was completely innocent of this crime. And whenever they came up with alternate explanations to combat a lot of the so-called evidence against him, they actually made some pretty reasonable and logical points. Of course, right from the outset, my biggest misgiving about Bowman as a suspect was his age, as he was 66 years old at the time this crime took place. I know elderly people are capable of committing horrific murders, but breaking into a house, shooting 2 people in their sleep, and abducting a child without leaving any incriminating evidence seems like a pretty daunting task when you're a senior citizen. I mean, no one committed more home invasions than Joseph James DeAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer, but the most likely reason he decided to stop after a certain point is because he got old. And of course, throw in the fact that Bowman was allegedly drinking pretty heavily prior to the murders, and it seems less likely that he could have pulled this off. It doesn't sound like Bowman had any known history of violence prior to this point, as his only previous arrest was for a DUI. I guess the biggest red flag is that Bowman decided to leave for Canada the day after the murders took place, but what most accounts of this story do not mention is that he didn't go directly to Canada. He first drove to Michigan to see his friend, whom he was planning to give his mobile home to. Given that Michigan is right next to Ontario, you'd assume a guy who was planning to flee the country because he'd committed 3 murders would just cross over the border, right? Well, actually, Bowman then traveled west to the other side of the country in order to visit one of his sisters in Montana. It was only after that when he finally crossed the border into Canada. But that's not all. Bowman then went to visit a friend of his in British Columbia, where he received a call from his friend in Michigan, who let him know that FBI agents were looking for him. Instead of fleeing, Bowman then went to see the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who subsequently put him in touch with the FBI and an agent that interviewed Bowman over the phone. After that, Bowman then traveled to his new residence in the town of Inuvik, and only wound up being detained once it became apparent that he failed to disclose his previous DUI conviction while entering the country. When you look at Bowman's movements, he really doesn't seem like a guy who was making much of an attempt to hide, and it's probably nothing more than a coincidence that he happened to leave Rockingham County the day after the Short murders took place. Of course, the police and FBI thoroughly inspected Bowman's van, mobile home, and virtually everything associated with them, but they cannot find one piece of physical evidence to match him to the murder scene, which once again is quite an incredible feat for a 66-year-old man who had supposedly spent the entire day drinking. They also couldn't find the murder weapon, and Bowman maintained that the story his landlord, Gary Lemons, shared about waving a pistol at him was completely false, and that he had never even owned such a gun. Bowman finally got the opportunity to share his side of the story when he was interviewed by the Roanoke Times in 2004, 2 years after the murders. As you can imagine, Bowman's life became quite difficult once he was named as a person of interest, and he would often run into situations where he'd find a new place to stay, but then would be asked to leave once they learned he was connected to an horrific crime. The only potential motive which has ever been put forward for Bowman are Gary Lemons' claims that he heard Bowman say he had paid a man from Virginia to move a mobile home and would kill him if he did not complete the job or return the money. Well, Bowman brought up 2 logical points to refute this claim during his Roanoke Times interview. He said that having worked his entire life as a contractor, he would have known better than to ever pay someone in advance to move his mobile home before they actually completed the job. And while it's true that Bowman had made arrangements to move his mobile home during that time period, he claimed he knew plenty of people in Rockingham County who would have been capable of doing the job, and he never would have needed to travel over 30 miles to Henry County, Virginia, to hire the services of Michael Short. In fact, Bowman did get a local company to move the mobile home from Lemons' property to his friend's farm. And besides, if he really wanted to kill Michael and his wife over a business dispute, why would he go to the trouble of abducting their daughter and disposing of her remains in the same county where he was living? I know that Bowman's mobile home was parked only about a mile away from the spot where Jennifer's remains were found, but Bowman was not living in it at the time. He was leaving it there on his friend's farm because his landlord, Gary Lemons, got angry that he was not going to be giving it to him. So he told Bowman he couldn't leave the mobile home on his property and had to park it elsewhere until his friend from Michigan traveled down there to pick it up. So once again, this is another seemingly incriminating detail which doesn't have nearly as much significance once you look at the situation as a whole. Now, the main reason Bowman even popped up on the radar as a person of interest to begin with is because of his landlord, Gary Lemons, but apparently, Lemons seemed to have some sort of personal grudge against him because he did not give him the deed to his mobile home when he left for Canada. To be fair, I think the biggest reason Lemons became suspicious is because he found a map of Virginia in Bowman's rental home, which appeared to have an X at the location of the Short home, but it's not like they could say with absolute certainty that it was the exact location. I'm not sure if Bowman ever offered an alternate explanation for what the X on the map was for, but if he was actually marking the murder scene, would he really have been so careless as to leave the map behind when he fled the country? I'm not saying that Lemons deliberately lied for the express purpose of framing Bowman for murder. I do think it's possible that Lemons may have genuinely believed that Bowman might be the killer, but he embellished other details of his story, such as the part about the gun, in order to make Bowman look more suspicious. I mean, a substantial reward was offered for an arrest in this case, and a couple of other guys wound up being charged a few years later when they flat out lied about seeing Bowman carrying Jennifer's body. Even though Lemons did pass a polygraph in regards to his story, who's to say he didn't do the exact same thing? Anyway, the FBI eventually announced that they no longer consider Bowman to be a suspect, and while I didn't understand the reasoning at first, it now makes a lot more sense to me. Most of the suspicious evidence which seemed to implicate Bowman has pretty much been discredited, and there really is nothing to link him to the crime. I actually feel pretty bad for the guy, as it sounds like he had to live out his twilight years under a cloud of suspicion until he passed away a few years ago. Unfortunately, I really don't have much idea about who the real perpetrator could be, but I have a feeling that it's someone who has yet to appear on the radar. Whoever it was, I believe that their motive for this crime was probably to kidnap Jennifer, and they felt like they had to murder her parents in order to pull this off. It would not surprise me at all if this was another Jamie Kloss situation, except that the perpetrator decided to kill the person they abducted. If the killer was not Garrison Bowman, then they're probably still out there somewhere, so if you happen to have any information on the Short family murders, please contact the FBI tip line at 1-800-225-5324. That's 1-800-225-5324. Anyway, another special thanks to Jackie Elliott for doing such a great job at narrating our opening. If you've already entered this contest, you are automatically eligible for all of our future random drawings, so you don't have to do anything. But if you would like to enter and haven't already done so, please send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. Once again, send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we've released a new episode about the unsolved murder of David Buller, a Canadian cold case from Toronto, which I covered during my live show at the True Crime Podcast Festival in Chicago last month. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also released another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a special thanks to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Jen M., Nick MS, Lyndon M., Caitlin, Carol, and Alexis W. Thank you all so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. And before we bring this episode to a close, we have a special announcement. We are going to be taking next Wednesday, September the 4th off, and will not be releasing a new episode. But the good news is that we will instead drop one of our older bonus Patreon episodes into our feed. Since we originally joined Patreon last April, we've built up an extensive catalog of exclusive episodes and other bonus content, so we thought next week would be a good opportunity to give the general public a sampling of the type of content we offer on Patreon. So when you look in your feed next Wednesday, You'll find a Patreon episode I recorded last year about one of my pet cases, the murder of Ken Heitholt, which led to the wrongful conviction of Ryan Ferguson. Anyway, we shall resume with releasing our regular episodes on September the 11th, so after the release of our bonus episode, I shall see you again in 2 weeks for another brand new edition of The Trail Went Cold.